you can sit there and analyze your play, or being able to self-assess your performance is probably something that a coach would value very greatly, and being able to say, oh, this person can analyze their own play and identify maybe even what's going wrong with their play. So what I'm doing here actually as an analyst is that I'm kind of in charge of trying to assess and help, coaches understand where players could move for improvement, whether that be helping them understand like how they can improve in their play, whether that be watching videos or interviewing, and having them understand where potential problems could be, or even using statistics or analyzing data that we could get from their play while they're playing, or even from different programs like Overwatch has, like Oversumo or Overbuff, any of those types of programs where I can help them interpret their information there so that they can improve their ability. And so the general theme is kind of more towards giving coaches information that they can use to understand how their players are improving, or even compare players against one another to say maybe we should start this one if we're going against an aggressive team or this type of team, so that they can have better information at understanding the weaknesses and strengths of the team. So that's kind of my role as the analyst. So I'm an analyst and I'm also a researcher, and so the research aspect of me, since I'm in the psychology department under human factors psychology, is I'm also working on trying to understand specifically in Overwatch or even League of Legends, you can apply some of these similar concepts to that, is what makes an expert player. And so there's some research out there, very small amounts of research, that looks at mechanical skill and looks at game sense, or what you can maybe call situational awareness. And so situational awareness is pretty much just being able to identify a situation, being able to predict what could happen, and then being able to use that information that you've identified to explain that context. It is often hard to actually assess, and Esports provides a really great avenue to actually do this, where you can sit down with a player and have them run through the game, and you can probe these very specific types of questions where I can ask them and understand, are they able to make sense of the state of the game that they're currently in? And so that's one way that you can assess situational awareness, and this is probably something very similar to like ult tracking. And so in the game sense would be a pro player's ability to track his mirror. So like, let's say a Reinhardt is playing against another Reinhardt. And so being able to identify when he's using his pin, when he's hit a fire strike and actually is gaining his ult charges is important. But the next step to that would be able to understand, has he done that in an amount of time that he has his ultimate? So that now you know his ultimate is up, so you can then project or predict that in the next team fight, he's probably going to try to use it. So you as the pro player need to start playing more defensively. And so this is like situational awareness, and being able to measure that is sometimes a complicated task actually. And so that's one thing I kind of want to tackle here, is to be able to provide some sort of measurement of this game sense measurement, and say this is, and provide that maybe to a coach and say, this is how you could try to measure that. And if you're trying to think of, do we need to work on this player's game sense, and then providing methods on how to actually do that. So one of the difficulties I think with situational awareness, and where players potentially are making problems in trying to get better at situational awareness, is it is kind of hard to get better at. And so it's continuously being aware of your environment. And so it's really hard to do that in a sustained task. And so games they're fun and enjoyable, but you need to make sure you have the motivation to say, at this point in time, for maybe 10 minutes or in this match, I'm going to ult track this specific character, and continue to do that and try to practice that. And at specific points in the game, ask yourself, does he have his ult? And these are questions that you can ask yourself. And this would probably potentially be better done in a VOD, is maybe while you're making the VOD, be like, I think he has ultimate. And then later on you can go back and watch and see, were you correct? Did the counter that you're fighting against actually have their ultimate? And so it provides that feedback for yourself to be able to say, okay, I tracked it correctly. And another thing you need to do there is to think critically about, what was it about that situation that allowed me to identify that they had the ultimate. And so being able to understand those cues for yourself is, I think, an important thing that you could do to help understand your situational awareness. There could be other things that you could be asking yourself as well that involve the game, like continuously trying to ask yourself questions such as, what's the status of my healers? And then trying to say, do I know where they are? And so being able to say, I think the healers, positioned back here behind, so like in Junkertown, the healer's up top, maybe it's Zenyatta, and this is the first point cap, and he's in the top left. And that's where he's sitting, so he can hit people with orbs and hit discords. And so being able to say, okay, he is there. And that's one way that you can try to improve your situational awareness, by asking yourself in-game questions and then assessing, were you correct? And this is a hard thing, because you have to be cognizant of your own play and say, was I correct or not? And sometimes that can be hard, especially if you're only playing Overwatch for fun. But in a competitive scene where you can sit there and analyze your play, or being able to self-assess your performance, is probably something that a coach would value very greatly. And being able to say, oh, this person can analyze their own play and identify maybe even what's going on with their play. And so situational awareness is really hard, but the important thing is try to hit those three themes of, what information are you utilizing? Like, so in the environment, are you using the kill feed? Are you using, are you tracking and seeing how many times the enemy killed you? And so mechanical skill could be things like them being able to input specific types of abilities together and being able to pull that off. And so like one character like Winston, there's this thing called juggling. And so that's just them being able to jump, whether that be long jump or short jump, and hit with Winston's ultimate ability. And so doing that, though, is not relatively simple or easy. You need to practice that and do that, and go into like a practice range pretty much, and just practice hitting the bots or practice hitting a computer AI and get that ability down. So that's mechanical skill. Or a lot of the time people like to think about that as like a Widow being able to get headshots quickly, or being able to I believe just quickly move over to a head and just boom, gone. And that's mechanical skill. And so being able to explain and understand that is a very important area to understand how a pro player could advance. So in understanding, mistakes that players could be making in mechanical skill could be, I would say one of the biggest things would be not playing the game enough to understand the techniques that maybe they should be pulling off, so different combinations. So specifically for something like Roadhog, one of his biggest combinations that he should be utilizing is getting his hook, pulling them in, and then moving in and getting a headshot off of that, and then hitting him with a melee. And so that does, I don't know the exact numbers of damage, but it should kill a 200 HP target. And so that's kind of a technique that as an off-tank player you should be practicing and repeating this continuously until you can pull it off. And so that's one thing I think that players are not always knowledgeable about, is that there should be some maneuvers that you should be pulling off to be able to understand that. And I think that's what, at the higher levels of pro play, that they've been repeating this, and maybe even going into practice ranges, or when they're playing a game, making sure the only time they use their hook, they're going to actually only do this, even if they're kind of losing, but they want to practice that skill and be able to repeat it continuously. And that's kind of this idea of deliberate practice, where they're specifically working on that one area that they've seen some sort of detriment in. And so I think with mechanical skill, it's understanding that, what you should be doing there. Another thing could be figuring out what works best for them. So there is always the idea of, should you be high sensitivity or low sensitivity? I think in the grand scheme of things, it should be more towards what works best for you. So playing around with that, like until you find an area where you just feel comfortable, like, oh, I can work on this, and I'm hitting headshots consistently. And that's I think one area where mechanical skill players kind of see that I should be this high sensitivity because my favorite pro player is playing at this high level of sensitivity, is maybe don't do that first. Start off in an area where you feel comfortable, and don't be afraid to change it, but allow yourself. One of the things I think players do half the time is they're like, oh, I changed it, but I didn't see any difference. Give it time so that you can improve your ability and see, is there actually something here? Maybe give it a day or two, I would say, of playing multiple times, not just one match, and say, do I feel like I'm getting better? And being able to critically think about how you're hitting those headshots. Because that's an important thing in any game, is being able to hit specifically what you would want. I think those are kind of the two areas that you could probably practice as a player wanting to improve. Another thing that I would say maybe isn't like a huge problem, but as a researcher, something that could be an area of anyone out there who wants like a master's thesis or something like that could be looking at the transfer in Overwatch. So a lot of players play this game called OSU, which is a rhythm game of where they'll go and click and tap things or even drag across. But one question that a researcher could have is, does that transfer to me actually being able to hit headshots? And so there's, people on both ends in the gaming community that would say, it works, and there are people that say, oh no, don't do it. But from the research perspective, I don't think it would transfer because it's that 2D environment. Another area that I'm really interested as well is understanding decision making. So game sense is a huge part of being able to make what we'll call an adequate decision at an important amount of time. And so Overwatch is a very interesting area in decision making because it's very dynamic. And so, or any game, even like League of Legends, is the state's always going to be changing. And so the player needs to be able to understand that state, but from that state be able to make what we will call decisions that can either win the game or win the team fight. And so that's something that's very important, but it's hard to train. And so being able to, have players and understand their tendencies to, maybe they're being more aggressive, so they're going to use an ult right now when they maybe shouldn't have, and they know that they were up already and they should have pulled back on their defensive strategy and just waited for the next team fight to happen. And so being able to understand that in a sense of interviewing subject matter experts is actually the way that I plan on tackling that specific problem, which is, people in this room that come and play Overwatch and try to progress. And so that's an interesting area to try to tackle and explain, this is how a main tank should be playing, and these are the specific goals using what we would call hierarchical task analysis and human factors to explain this is what the main tank should be doing. And so the coach can then provide feedback to the players and say, this is how you should be playing. But in this video that we're observing right now, you're not kind of exhibiting some of these behaviors, and so maybe that's what we should try to improve on. And so just sitting down with the coach and viewing that VOD, but being the researcher that can provide the information for the coach. And human factors, for those of you that don't know, is trying to understand a system. And so esports, or video games in general, are a system. And so the players interacting with this format, and they have to, perform specific tasks, and then they're going to get feedback on how well they perform that task. And so human factors is just trying to understand, how can we understand the human in that system? And so there's a lot of methods, whether they be quantitative or qualitative, that you can use to help identify, even for coaches, how well is a player performing in this task. And so there's a lot of methods like hierarchical task analysis. There's a method that I'm going to be using called the critical decision method, or even cognitive task analysis, that you can utilize to help understand what are the players thinking and what are the players doing, so that so the coach can then contextualize and explain, maybe at this time you shouldn't have been doing this, and maybe you could have done this. There's even measurements of social situational awareness that in human factors that they utilize a lot of the time to train pilots, or even to understand how someone work with a drone. And so that's really the application that human factors, I think, can bring into esports, is that we have a lot of unique methods that can help and understand what the players are doing, and how can we create or even help a player that's a novice wanting to become a pro player, and so that they can then utilize their feedback and teach themselves to become that pro player. Or even for a coach, how do I move this player who's mechanically gifted but doesn't have game sense, what method can I use, which is, there's a whole bunch of situational awareness methods that you could try to utilize to pinpoint and understand, oh, this may be where they're going wrong, and so I should help them with this specific task. And then you can provide training opportunities for them as a coach. And so there's a lot of areas for human factors psychology to kind of implement and help understand, esports. And another current booming area too in human factors is expertise actually. So a lot of the time expertise research has predominantly been validated in chess studies, and that's because they have an ELO rating system. Esports, you usually have some sort of rating system, like an ELO rating system, where you have to compete against other players and it puts you at a specific rank. And so researchers can potentially use that as a way to understand how can people, how does expertise perform over time. And so a new game comes out, you can maybe work with the developers as a human factors researcher to start getting some of that data of what are players doing, what are the differences that we're seeing in their performance metrics, and try to understand how are they improving. And that can be done through interviews or even just collecting the data in the backlogs that's going on there. And so that's kind of the unique area that human factors can help with. And so that's kind of where I'm at in trying to help understand esports. A good place to do that as well is like Watch Anyone. I think it's Captain Planet on Overwatch. He does a lot of really great stuff about what being a clutch player is, and so he has some articles out there that are posted on like kind of his blog, where he goes in and he's gathered data from Overwatch League and assesses, what are clutch players, and so what do they look like. Everyone says that Carpe is one of the most clutch players, but how do we quantify that? So the analyst position can be done by anyone who's a critical thinker and has knowledge of, I would say, research. And so being able to understand statistics could potentially help any coach, and being able to describe to them what's going on with the team, or being able to explain win rates and percentages and stuff like that. So being able to have knowledge about that. In psychology, a lot of the time, you're going to get a lot of that stats knowledge, maybe in a master's degree or a PhD. At the undergraduate level, I do teach statistics because I am in a PhD program. So I have knowledge in that, and I don't know how well some of my students would be able to just come into this particular environment and say, oh, I can do that. But being able to understand statistics could help potentially. But another thing that I think is really important is that understand that statistics always can't explain every single context. So they do have their limitations, and so that's where VOD reviews actually come in, and I think are a really great way to potentially help players understand that. And so being able to understand how to do VOD reviews yourself, and then even help players identify problems in their play. And so being able to be a subject matter expert in the domain of play, that's being aware of how to assess, your own play and critically think about that. And so you don't necessarily need a degree, I think, to be an analyst. There is currently a lot of people that just, can go into this role because they are critical thinkers, and being able to explain to players, maybe try this next time, and being able to experiment with that. For me here at Wichita State University, I am in a PhD program, so I kind of just found Joe here, who's actually the community representative for the Wichita State University esports team, and I talked to him and saw interest in helping them analyze any data they would have. And so going out there, I think, and meeting your contacts and trying to social network and find out how can you get involved is a very important way, especially if you don't think you have the skills. There might be things you can learn on the job, and being able to get those specific skills. A lot of the time when I learn research, it's on the job. I gotta figure out how to do this, and I have to teach myself maybe in a week and then perform it. And so that's, I think, another specific skill just anyone could benefit from. To me, the best way to do that is probably by email. And so by emailing me and contacting me through there if you want to get involved in research, or ask me some questions about what you could do with psychology and human factors.